What you're looking at is a print from the 1800s depicting a famous story from the Hebrew Bible. In 1 Samuel chapter 5, the Philistines, the arch-enemies of the Israelites, capture the Ark of the Covenant, the sacred chest believed to hold the Ten Commandments, and an object intimately linked to the divine presence of God. They brought it back to the city of Ashdod and stored it in the temple of their god Dagon, setting it up right next to a statue. The next day, however, the Philistines find the statue of Dagon lying face down on the ground. Thinking nothing of it, they set it back up, but the next day it happens again. Dagon on the ground in front of the ark, and this time his head and hands have been cut off. The story is meant to underscore the power of the Israelite God. Through his manifestation in the ark, he's able to topple and humiliate a foreign god. But who is this god, Dagon? The Hebrew Bible describes him something like the national god of the Philistines, and if you try looking him up online, you'll find a lot of fish imagery, like he was some kind of ancient merman or fish god. This became accepted wisdom back in the 1800s and early 1900s, making its way into biblical guidebooks and illustrated dictionaries. But both of these interpretations are wrong. Dagon was neither a national god of the Philistines nor a fish god. But to understand who Dagon truly was, we first need to dive into the archaeology of the Philistines. The Philistines were an ancient people who settled the southeast coastal plain of the Mediterranean, sometime around the 12th century BCE. They likely descended from one of the so-called Sea Peoples. These were various tribes originating from different areas around the Mediterranean world, eventually resettling in the eastern Mediterranean during the Late Bronze Age. The Philistines in particular were known for their advanced knowledge in metalworking, their well-equipped army, and, unlike their Israelite neighbors, a taste for pork. We can see a striking example of their possible origins by comparing Philistine pottery with pottery found in and around Greece. This here is a pot from the Philistine city of Ekron, and this one right here is from the Greek island of Kalymnos. Very similar decoration and design, suggesting that the Philistines originally migrated from the Aegean world to the coast of the eastern Mediterranean, taking with them pottery-making know-how from their homeland. The Philistines enter into the biblical narrative once they begin to expand their influence and authority into Israelite territory, and they show up again and again in several biblical stories as Israel's fierce military and ideological enemy, like in the famous showdown between the future King David and the giant Goliath. So who did the Philistines worship? Philistine religion involved a mix of gods, some that they brought with them from their old Aegean homeland, and new deities that they encountered in the eastern Mediterranean. For example, check out this inscription. A royal dedication dating to the 7th century BCE, found at the Philistine city of Ekron. It mentions a goddess spelled with the letters PTGYH. No one really knows how this name was pronounced or who it refers to. The inscription is a dedication from some sort of prince of Ekron who built a temple in her honor. It reads, "The house built for PTGYH, his lady. May she bless him and protect him." We don't know who this goddess was. It may refer to Pidre, a Ugaritic goddess and daughter of the Canaanite storm god Baal. Some theorize it refers to the Greek mother goddess Gaia, and PTGYH either spells out Potnia Gaia, meaning lady or mistress Gaia, or Pytho Gaia, meaning Gaia from Pytho, referring to the sanctuary of Delphi. Both of these interpretations tie her to ancient Greek religion, but in the end, we simply don't know. PTGYH remains a mysterious Philistine goddess to this day. Archaeologists have also discovered several goddess figurines at several Philistine cities, Ekron, Ashdod, and Ashkelon, all dating to the Iron Age 1 period. These are female figurines, usually depicted either as standing with their arms raised or seated, creating a little platform. Just like the Philistine and Mycenaean pottery I showed you before, these figurines strongly resemble ones found around the Aegean Sea, with examples from mainland Greece, Crete, and Cyprus. This adds even more evidence of the Aegean roots of the Philistines. While it's hard to say which goddess these figurines represent, they likely had something to do with Philistine household religion. Later archaeological finds showed that the Philistines also used more naturalistic figurines in their religious practices. These are often linked to the Canaanite goddess Astarte. These figurines show up a bit later in Philistine history, during the Iron Age 2 period, and have been found in cities like Ashdod, Ashkelon, and Ekron. Astarte was linked with fertility, so these figurines likely had a fertility-related purpose. Other figurines found at Iron Age 2 Philistine sites include the so-called Judean pillar figurines, which are sometimes linked to the goddess Asherah. Similar figurines have also been found at Israelite sites, which indicates that Canaanite and Israelite domestic religion influenced at least some Philistine religion. This is not all that surprising. While the Philistines likely did come from the Aegean world, archaeologists now believe that they were a multicultural group who blended with local Canaanite culture. So in terms of religion, the Philistines were becoming more like their neighbors, and their goddess worship shows this kind of cultural blending. But despite this wealth of archaeological evidence, we really don't have a good grasp of the exact identity of the gods and goddesses that they worshipped. The most we can say is that the Philistine pantheon included both Aegean and Canaanite gods, including possibly Asherah and Astarte, and definitely this mysterious PTGYH, as well as one male god relating to the weather, possibly Baal. Several inscriptions from Philistine sites mention Baal, as does the Hebrew Bible. But you might notice that one figure is lacking from this summary: Dagon. We don't have any archaeological evidence for the Philistine worship of Dagon. The Bible stands alone in claiming this, which seriously calls into the question the notion that he was a major deity in the Philistine pantheon, let alone their national god. Although we don't have any archaeological evidence that the Philistines worship Dagon, he does show up in the pantheons of their neighbors to the northeast, the peoples of ancient Syria along the Euphrates River Valley. Dagon was worshipped in this middle Euphrates region as far back as the 3rd millennium BCE, stretching all the way to the 2nd century BCE. According to various sources, Dagon was a powerful high god in this region, though it's difficult to call him the god of any particular thing or domain, like how we stereotypically say that Thor is the god of thunder or Helios is the god of the sun. Dagon was the god of a lot of things. Some sources call him the Lord Creator, which would make him some sort of chief creator god on par with the Canaanite god El or the Israelite god Yahweh. Other sources call him Lord of the Valley, as in ruler of the Euphrates River Valley and its people. He was also called the father of the gods, and with his divine consort, the goddess Shalash, he was believed to be the father of the main gods of the middle Euphrates region, and sources from the city of Ugarit say he was the father of the storm god Baal. This has led to some confusion over the years, because Ugaritic texts generally say that Baal was the son of El, though it's likely the people of Ugarit equated Dagon with El. An inscription dedicating a sacrifice to Dagon was found inside of a late Bronze Age temple on the Acropolis of the city. Although scholars initially identified this temple as a temple of Dagon, many scholars now think it was a temple of El, and the people of Ugarit associated El and Dagon due to their identical status as chief high gods. His major cult centers were in the cities of Terka and Tutul, both located in eastern Syria. Terka was home to one of Dagon's most important temples, and it was sometimes known as a city beloved of Dagon. And the temple wasn't just a place of worship, it was also an administrative center where the local government collected taxes and held political ceremonies. Local kings would even make pilgrimages to the temple there. A letter from the governor of Terka orders a king of a nearby city to visit the temple to bow down before Dagon. The other great cultic city of Dagon, Tutul, was more of a prophecy hub. If you were a local ruler and wanted some sort of insight into whether you should form an alliance or go to battle, head to the Dagon priests of Tutul for some supernatural advice. So the combined literary and archaeological evidence shows that Dagon was indeed a popular deity in the ancient Near East, but his worship was heavily centralized in the middle Euphrates region, not the land of Canaan. So that brings us back to the question, did the Philistines really worship Dagon? While we don't have any archaeological evidence of Dagon worship at Philistine sites, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's completely out of the realm of possibility. As the archaeologist Jeffrey Emanuel says in his research, arguments from archaeological silence must be made carefully because it's hard to prove a negative based only on material evidence. As in, it's difficult to prove that the Philistines did not worship Dagon. The absence of material evidence doesn't necessarily mean something didn't exist. Some scholars have floated the idea that the Philistines might have been introduced to Dagon during their migration to the region or through cultural exchange with the northeast, where Dagon was already worshipped. Remember, back in the late Bronze Age, Dagon was known to the people of Ugarit on the Syrian coast, which was a major trading hub, and it's feasible that Philistine traders could have come across a Dagon cult there. But even if we can imagine such a process of cultural transmission, that doesn't make it the most likely explanation for why the Bible associates Dagon with the Philistines. To quote Dr. Emanuel again, these theories may ultimately be an attempt to force the biblical textual evidence to match the archaeological evidence, when they often are at odds. The books that link Dagon with the Philistines were actually written long after the purported events they describe. For example, 1 Samuel is often dated to around 600 BCE or later, while the events it talks about would have happened centuries earlier, back in the 11th and 10th centuries BCE. With this kind of time gap, we're talking hundreds of years, it's unlikely that the writers had an accurate understanding of Philistine culture from the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age. Plus, the Philistines are often portrayed as Israel's arch enemies throughout the Hebrew Bible, and these portrayals don't always reflect who the Philistines actually were. It's more likely that the Israelite writers portrayed the Philistines in ways that don't fully match their actual beliefs or practices. The strongest archaeological evidence we have for Philistine religion points more toward one or more goddesses. Okay, so whether or not the Philistines worship Dagon, what's with the whole fish merman thing? As I said in the intro, many commentators over the years came to believe that Dagon was some kind of fish god. This idea comes from a popular interpretation of his name. linking it to the Hebrew word dog, meaning fish. But this has no basis in reality. There's no data suggesting that Dagon was anything other than a regular human-shaped god. No fish tail, no scales, and in fact we can trace where this fish god story began. Post-biblical Christian and Jewish commentators. The ancient Christian theologian Jerome is the first to make this connection between the fish etymology and the god's name, writing long after Dagon worship had likely ended. However, for him, it's a derogatory play on words. Jerome argued that Dagon really means sorrowful fish, based on wordplay in Hebrew, so he's not exactly making a good faith etymological argument. The idea was later popularized by medieval Jewish commentators, such as the French rabbi Shlomo Yitzhaki, better known as Rashi. In his commentary on the Bible, he makes the connection between the Hebrew word dog and Dagon. The later Rabbi David Kimhi took this fish idea a step further. Based on the mentions of hands and arms in the Samuel story, he suggested that Dagon was made up of both human and fish parts, and thus was a kind of merman. This idea was further boosted by the 19th century commentator Henry Lee, and it became common among 19th century commentators and biblical interpreters to represent Dagon as a kind of merman-like being. But again, there's no evidence for any of this. We actually don't know what his name means. Some have argued it relates to another Semitic root word, Dagon, meaning grain. This interpretation is supported by the Roman-era writer Philo of Byblos, who identifies Dagon with grain, though there's not a ton of evidence he was an agrarian god. One ancient text does refer to him as Lord of the Seeds, but this only occurs once in all of our evidence of Dagon, so it's a little bit of a stretch to call him a grain god. The scholar Louis Feliu, who's probably the leading authority on Dagon, thinks we should not take Philo of Byblos at his word, and that the name Dagon probably derives from an unknown pre-Semitic language spoken in prehistoric times. But one thing's for sure, his name has nothing to do with fish. The idea that Dagon was a merman or fish god is a later invention. So Dagon stands as a reminder of how historical and archaeological data don't always tell the same story. While the Bible paints him as a chief deity of the Philistines, archaeology and other historical sources indicate that Dagon was primarily revered in the Euphrates Valley, and that Philistine religion primarily focused on goddesses. The fish god label is also far from reality. Centuries of shoddy etymological theories morphed a creator god from the Euphrates Valley into a mythical merman. A lot of what we know about Philistine culture comes from archaeology, perhaps even what they looked like. The footage you saw earlier of these guys in nifty feathered helmets might be an artistic representation of the Philistines. This is my own footage that I shot at the mortuary temple of Ramses III. Ramses battled against a confederation of sea peoples, and he commemorated his victory on the walls of his temple. One of the tribes he defeated was called the Peliset, which scholars believe is the Egyptian name for the Philistines. I went to this temple back in 2020, and in my opinion, this is the coolest footage I took, just because I'm a Bible nerd and it's so cool to see in person the potential war uniform of a Philistine soldier. But I also shot several gigabytes worth of footage that I've been wanting to share for years. So I'm publishing a bonus video about the temple over on Nebula. Nebula is an independent streaming platform owned by us, the creators. It's an ad-free platform directly supported by Nebula subscribers, which means we're free to produce content without the constraints of advertising, allowing us to make more creative and diverse original content. I'm launching my own series on Nebula called Sacred Spaces. Think of it like an archaeological travel show. As a historian of ancient Mediterranean religion, I have visited a lot of ancient sites around the region that intersect with the study of religion. Really famous sites like Göbekli Tepe, the Dome of the Rock, the Pyramids of Giza, and also less famous but still very cool sites like the ancient city of Anavarza in southeastern Turkey, where I literally climbed a freaking ladder to get on top of an ancient castle. Each episode of Sacred Spaces will focus on a site that I've personally visited over the years and will mostly feature my own footage. The first episode about Ramses III is already up, and you can expect monthly episodes on Nebula going forward. Nebula is home to a ton of exclusive content, and we're talking bigger, higher budget productions that we could not do alone on YouTube. One of my favorite creators, Tom Nicholas, just published his first feature-length documentary called Boomers. It's about how the baby boomer generation runs the world, and somehow ensured that wealth is disproportionately flowing to the elderly. This is a great example of how Nebula elevates independent content creators, transforming video essayists into feature-length documentary producers. And Nebula is creator-owned. When you sign up for Nebula, you're directly supporting us, the Nebula creators. If you sign up using my link nebula.tv/religionforbreakfast, you can get Nebula for a 40% discount off of an annual plan, which clocks in at just $36 for a year or $3 a month. Again, that's nebula.tv/religionforbreakfast. Hope to see you there.